podcast is a bold, spirit-led space where truth is spoken without compromise and faith is stirred without performance. Hosted by Pastor Aaron J., this podcast is dedicated to awakening believers from spiritual familiarity and calling them back to authentic relationship with God. Each episode dives deep into real conversations about salvation, leadership, church culture, spiritual warfare, obedience, identity, healing, and the weight of God's presence. This is not surface-level inspiration, this is transformation. Whether you're wrestling with doubt, recovering from church hurt, seeking clarity in leadership, or hungry for revival in your personal walk, this podcast meets you where you are and challenges you to grow. Pastor Aaron J. speaks with transparency, conviction, and compassion, blending biblical truth with real-life application in a way that is both relatable and spiritually piercing. The goal is simple: awaken hearts, sharpen minds, and ignite a deeper hunger for God. This podcast is dedicated to those who refuse to stay asleep in comfortable religion, to the leaders carrying silent burdens, to the believers who know there has to be more, to the ones rebuilding their faith after disappointment, and to every soul ready to encounter God beyond routine. Awakening your faith is more than a podcast. It's a call back to holiness, a call back to intimacy, a call back to truth. If this podcast blesses you, make sure you like, share, and subscribe so we can continue spreading the message and awakening faith around the world. See you on the live.
Good morning, and welcome back to the Awakening Your Faith podcast with your host for the most. I'm yours truly, AJ is live. Some of you may say Pastor A, as they say, of course. And if you're tuning in on today, I want you to pause just for a moment because this is a conversation and another episode, of course. This is one of those moments where we're going to talk about something that hits real life, right where you are. So if you haven't already, hit that like button, hit the share button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell that lets you know the next time that we go live or drop content right here on the Respective Angle Christian Network, and of course, right here on the Awakening Your Faith podcast. All right, folks. Of course, it is another episode. It is another Tuesday morning. We have to thank God for waking us up this morning. Thank God for keeping us in our right mind. And thank God for being a part of the land of the living. And of course, whether you're home, whether you are at work, whether you are just cruising the streets, it doesn't matter what time of day it is, whether you're catching the replay, I want you to lean on today and pay attention to this podcast on today, because it's something that will change your very perspective on life. Amen. And so this is not just another episode. This is one of the moments, these moments where we're going to talk about something that hits real life right where you are. And so let me ask you a question. Have you ever looked at the world around you and thought, what is really going on? Right? So much different things going on in this world, because right now we are living in a time where everything feels heightened, right? I'm pretty sure you would agree. Right now, tensions are high, voices are loud, opinions are everywhere. Sometimes you're on your social media and you scroll for 5 minutes and you'll see conflict. You'll see division, uncertainty. People arguing about politics, identity, morality, truth. Families are divided over beliefs. Friendships are strained over perspectives. Even in spaces that used to feel stable, things feel like they're shifting all of a sudden, right? And if we're being honest, a lot of people are trying to figure out how to navigate this thing called life in this moment. Right? They start to ask themselves questions such as, what do I say in this moment? What do I stand for? When do I even speak? And when do I stay quiet? And maybe the deeper question is this: does my voice even matter? Because in a world full of noise, it's easy to feel like your voice is just one among millions. But what if that's not true? What if your voice carries more weight than you even realize? What if the reason you're alive in this exact moment in history is not random? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Because during Women's History Month, and I'm pretty sure most of you are well aware that this month is the month that we celebrate women's history, we see a lot of conversations about influence. We see a lot of conversations about leadership and the power of women throughout history. And that's important. But today, I don't want to just talk about history. I want to talk about purpose. I want to take you into a story that is thousands of years old, but feels like it was written for right now, for such a time as this. I want to talk to you about the story of a woman who didn't start with power, a woman who did not grow up expecting influence, a woman who found herself in a system that wasn't built for her. And yet, when the moment came, her voice changed everything. And that woman goes by the name of Esther, and her story is found in the book of Esther. Now, here's what makes her story so powerful. She wasn't trying to be a leader. She wasn't chasing influence. She wasn't building a platform, but she was simply living her life, navigating circumstances that she didn't even choose. She was an orphan, a minority in a powerful empire, a young woman trying to survive in a system that she didn't even control. And somehow she ends up in the palace. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself in a place that you didn't even plan for? A position that you didn't expect? A responsibility that you didn't ask for? A season that forced you to grow faster than you ever were even ready for? Because sometimes life will place you in a position that you didn't pursue. And the question becomes, what do you do when you get there? Because while Esther is adjusting to life in the palace, something is happening behind the scenes. Something is happening in the background. And that is this: a man rises to power with influence, authority, and a dangerous agenda. A system begins to move in a direction that threatens an entire group of people. And suddenly, Esther's position isn't just about her anymore, but it becomes about everyone that is connected to her. Now, let me bring that into today's perspective, because we're living in a world where systems still matter. Decisions made in high places still affect everyday people. Voices with influence still shapes outcomes. And the reality is, whether we like it or not, we are all part of systems in some way, whether it may be in your workplace, whether it may be in your communities, whether it may be in your families, or even different platforms. And in moments like this, the question is not just what is happening in the world, but the real question is, what is my role in it? Because at some point, Esther is asked a question that still echoes today. What if you were placed where you are for such a time like this? And that's the heart of today's episode. We're going to talk about divine positioning. We're going to talk about courage in uncomfortable moments. And we're going to talk about what it really means to use your voice in a world where silence often feels safer. So wherever you're listening from, whether you're driving, working, or just taking a moment to yourself, I want you to lean in, because this conversation might challenge you. It might stretch you. But most importantly, it might help you see your life a little differently, from a different lens, from a different perspective. Because what if you're not just here by chance? What if you are here on purpose? Because if we're going to understand the story of Esther, we have to start with something that most people overlook, and that is this: God will position you in places before you understand why you are there. Let me say that one more time. God will position you in places before you understand why you're there. I'm going to let that sit for a second. Because a lot of times we think purpose shows up with clarity. We sure do. We think that when God is doing something in our life, it's going to make sense right away. Sometimes it doesn't. Most times it don't. We think that we're going to understand the plan, the direction, the outcome. But if we're being honest with ourselves, that's not how life works. Absolutely not. That is not how life works. Most of the time, you find yourself in situations that don't fully make sense at first. Sometimes, for example, a job that you didn't plan for, a responsibility that you didn't expect, a season that stretched you beyond what you thought you could have handled. And you're sitting right there thinking, Lord, why am I here and how did I get here? But what if the question that you're asking, that question is premature? What if the real answer hasn't even been revealed yet? Because that is exactly what we see in the story of Esther. You see, before she was queen, she was just trying to survive. She was an orphan. No parents, no safety net, no clear future. She's being raised by a cousin by the name of Mordecai, living in the foreign empire where her people are not in control. Let's pause right there for a second, because I think sometimes we read Bible stories a little bit too fast and miss how real they are. You see, Esther wasn't born into privilege. She wasn't set up for success. She didn't grow up thinking, one day, I'm gonna be in the palace, No, she was actually navigating life just like many people today, trying to figure things out, trying to stay afloat, trying to make sense of circumstances that she didn't choose. And yet somehow she ends up in the palace. Now let's talk about that for a moment, because from the outside, that looks like a blessing. It looks like elevation. It looks like favor. And quite frankly, it is. It's all those things. But here's what we don't always talk about. Just because something looks like favor doesn't mean it's just for your comfort. Sometimes favor comes with responsibility. Sometimes elevation comes with expectation. Sometimes the door that opens in your life isn't just about you. And I think that's something that we need to hear in today's world, because we live in a culture that, celebrates getting to the next level. Whether it's more influence, more visibility, more opportunity, right? But we don't always talk about what comes with it. Because the truth is, where you are placed actually matters. And let me bring this into real life today, from today's perspective. You might be in a workplace right now where you don't feel like you belong. You might be in a position where you feel like you're underqualified. You might be in a room where you're wondering, how did I even get there? How did I get in this position? And instead of seeing it as purpose, you're seeing it as pressure. But have you asked yourself this question? What if it's both? Because Esther is in the palace, but she doesn't fully understand why just as yet. And while she's adjusting to this new life, something is happening behind the scenes. A man named Haman is rising in power. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because we're not just talking about ambition. We're talking about influence being used the wrong way. We're talking about power that is mixed with pride. We're talking about a system that is being manipulated to target a specific group of people. And if we're honest, that still happens today. We still see people in positions of power making decisions that affect entire communities. We still see systems that don't treat everyone fairly. We still see influence being used to push agendas that don't benefit everyone. So let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at something happening around you and thought, this isn't right? Have you ever been in an environment where you could see the tension, the imbalance, the unfairness, but you weren't sure what your role was in it? Because that's where Esther is. Whether she realizes it or not, she's in the palace while a decision is being made that will impact her own people. And at this point, she doesn't even fully understand that she's connected to it. And I think that's important because sometimes God positions you in places before you even realize what you're connected to. Come on now. You don't know the full picture of it yet. You don't see the future yet. You don't understand the assignment yet, but yet still you're there. And the question becomes, will you recognize the moment when it comes? Because eventually the truth reaches Esther. The decree is made. Her people are in danger, and suddenly everything starts to shift. Now her position has meaning. Now her presence matters. Now her voice is necessary. But here's what gets me about this story. And that is this, that she didn't ask to be in this position. She didn't campaign for it. She didn't plan for it. But when the moment came, she had to decide what she was doing with it. And that's where things get real for us today, because not everything in your life is something that you choose. You didn't choose every circumstance. You didn't choose every challenge. You didn't choose every responsibility. You still have to decide how you respond to it. Let me say that in a different way. You may not have chosen the position, but you're responsible for what you do in it. And I think that's one of the hardest truths for people to accept. Because it's easier to say that it isn't what I signed up for. It's easier to say that I didn't ask for this. It's easier to say that I'm not ready. But Esther's story shows us something totally different. And that is this: sometimes purpose finds you before you feel ready for it. Sometimes callings show up in uncomfortable places. Sometimes responsibilities comes before clarity. And that's where faith comes in, because at some point you have to trust where you are is not random, that your life is not just a series of coincidences, that doors that opened, the opportunities that came, the places that you've been positioned, there's something bigger connected to it. And during Women's History Month, this hits even deeper, because we're not just talking about one woman thousands of years ago. We're talking about a pattern. We're talking about how God has consistently raised women in moments that mattered. Women who didn't always have the loudest voice, but had the right voice at the right time. Women who didn't always start with power, but were placed in positions where their presence change outcomes. And maybe that's you. Maybe you're in a place right now where you feel uncertain. Maybe you're trying to figure out your role in everything that's happening around you. Maybe you're questioning whether your voice really matters. But what if you're asked the wrong question? What if instead of asking, why am I here? You started asking, what if I'm here for a reason? Because Esther didn't understand her position at first. But when the moment came, it all made sense to Esther. And I believe that happens in our lives too. Moments where everything connects, moments where you realize, this is why I went through that. This is why I'm here. This is why God actually allowed me to go down this path. But those moments come if you stay positioned, if you stay in the right position, if you don't run from the place where you've been assigned, if you don't shrink back from the opportunity in front of you. So I'll leave you with this before we move forward. Where has God positioned you right now? And are you looking at it as random, or are you starting to see it as purpose? Because the truth is, God doesn't just place people anywhere. And if you're there, there's a reason for it. Let's keep going, all right? Now let's take this into another level, because we've talked about being positioned like Esther. We've talked about having the courage to speak, but now we need to talk about something that a lot of people avoid, and that is leadership, decision-making, and authority. Let me ask you something. What do you do when it's not just about speaking anymore, but now it's about leading. Because it's one thing to have a voice. It's another thing for people to look at you and say, now lead us. That's pressure. That's responsibility. And if we're being honest, that's where a lot of people shrink back. Not because they don't have the ability, but because they don't feel ready. And that's where this next woman in scripture steps in. And her name is Deborah. Now, Deborah's story is found in the book of Judges. And if you have to understand the context to really feel the weight of who she actually was. This was a time in Israel where things were very unstable. Leadership was inconsistent. The people were in cycles, falling away, facing oppression, crying out, and then being delivered. It was chaotic. Does that sound familiar to you on today? Because if we're being honest, our world today feels very similar. Uncertainty, instability, people looking for direction, people looking for leadership that they can trust. And in the middle of that chaos, Deborah rises up. Now, here's what's so powerful about Deborah. She wasn't just a woman in the story. She was actually the leader. Let's let that sit for a second. She wasn't in the background. She's not supporting someone else. She wasn't waiting for permission. She was a judge over Israel. Come on now. Which means that people came to see her for decisions, for wisdom, for direction. She was still sitting in a position. She was sitting in a position where her voice didn't just matter. Her voice shaped outcomes. Now, let me ask you something. How many people listening right now are in positions where people are looking to you for answers? At work, in your family, in your church, in your community, right? People may not say it out loud, but they're watching you for direction. They're waiting to see how you respond. They're looking at you to see how you will handle pressure. And here's the tension. Sometimes you're in leadership before you feel ready for it. Deborah didn't step into a perfect situation. She stepped into a broken system, and God still used her. Now let's go a little bit deeper, because at some point, Deborah calls for a man who goes by the name of Barak. And she gives him instruction from God to go into battle. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because Barak starts to hesitate. He's like, he said, yo, sis, let me just let you know this right now. I'll go, but only if you go with me. Now, don't miss that. The leader is giving direction. She just gave a clear direction, but the one who is supposed to actually follow the direction is unsure. And in response to that, Deborah says, I'll go with you. If you're scared, if you're unsure, I'll go with you. I'll go with you, Barak. She said, I'll go with you, but the honor will not be yours. In other words, if you don't step up fully, someone else will get the victory. Let me bring that into today's times and today's perspective, because we see this all the time. Opportunities come, moments to lead shows up, and people start to hesitate. They start to get nervous. They second guess themselves. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I can do this. I'm not sure if I can get this through. They wait for someone else to move first. They look for confirmation and validation and reassurance. And sometimes while they're hesitating, someone else steps into the situation and says, I'm going to do it, because leadership requires decision, not hesitation, not perfection, not certainty, but decision. Let me ask you this. Have you ever missed an opportunity because you waited too long? And that's a lot of you. Some of you miss an opportunity because you've waited too long. You're hesitant. You're too hesitant, right? Have you ever held back because you didn't feel fully ready? Have you ever thought, let me wait until I'm more confident, more prepared, more sure of myself before I step into this? But what if leadership doesn't work like that? What if leadership doesn't work like that? What if readiness comes after obedience? Because Deborah didn't wait for perfect conditions. She operated in authority in the middle of chaos. And that's what makes her story so relevant right now, because we're living in a time where leadership is needed by far, but no one and not everyone is stepping up. People are waiting, they're watching, they're hesitating, and meanwhile, decisions are still being made. Systems are still moving. Lives are still being affected. So the question becomes, if not you, then who? Because Deborah understood something very powerful and something profound, and that is that you don't need to be the loudest person in the room to lead. You need to be the one who is willing to respond when it actually matters. And let's talk about this from a real world perspective, especially during Women's History Month. There are still spaces today where women are underestimated, where their voices are questioned, where their authority is challenged, where they feel like they have to prove themselves more than others. And yet Deborah stands in scripture as a reminder that God has always raised women into positions of leadership when it mattered most. Not as an exception, but as part of his plan and his will. So let me ask this question. Let me speak directly for a moment. Sorry. If you're a woman listening to this and you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or unsure about your place in leadership, Deborah's story is for you, because she didn't shrink. She didn't step back. She didn't say, guys, let someone else handle it. I ain't ready for it right now. I'm not too sure. What she did is that she stepped into what God called her to do, and she led, not perfectly, but faithfully. Now, here's the part that really connects to today. Deborah didn't just give instructions. She showed up. She went with Barak. She was present in the process. And that's another level of leadership, because real leadership is not just telling people what to do. It's being willing to stand with them. And I think that's what people are looking for right now in these times today. They're not looking for just voices, not just opinions, but leaders who are present, leaders who are consistent, leaders who don't disappear and disappoint when things get hard. So let me ask you something as we bring this together. Where in your life have you been called to lead? Not someday, not in the future, but right now. Where are people looking to you for direction? Where are decisions waiting to be made? Where is God calling you to step up, even if you didn't or don't feel fully ready? Because here's the truth. Leadership is not about having all the answers. It's about being willing to move when others hesitate. It's about trusting that God can use you even in imperfect conditions. And it's about understanding that your presence is in a moment can shift the outcome of that moment. Just like Esther used her voice, Deborah used her authority. Different roles, but same impact. And now we're here in our generation with our challenges, our systems, our moments. And the question is the same. Will you stay in the background, or will you step up into what God is calling you to do? Because history is not just something that we read. It's something that we're living right now. And your response actually matters. So let's bring this all the way home. Because if you've been listening up to this point, you've probably realized something, and that is this. This isn't just about Esther. It isn't just about Deborah, but this is about you. We started with Esther, positioned in a place that she didn't plan for, living in a moment that she didn't expect, and faced with a decision that would change everything. And then we moved to Deborah, leading in a time of chaos, making decisions when others hesitated, and stepping into authority in a system that wasn't always ready for her. We're talking about two different women here, two different situations, but the same thread runs through both of their lives. They showed up when it mattered. So let me ask you something. What moment are you standing in right now? Because we've talked about positioning, we've talked about courage, we've talked about leadership, but now it comes down to this, your response. What are you going to do with where you are? Because Esther could have stayed silent. Deborah could have stepped back, but they didn't. And because they didn't, history shifted. Lives were impacted. Outcomes was changed. And that's the part I don't want you to miss. Your life has impact, not just someday, not when everything is perfect, not when you feel fully ready, but right now, in the position you're in the spaces that you occupy, in the conversation that you're a part of. Your presence matters. Your voice matters. Your decisions matter. And I know we're living in a time where it's easy to feel small, easy to feel like one person can't really make a difference, easy to feel like the systems are too big, the problems are too complex, and the world is moving too fast. But Esther reminds us that one voice in the right moment can shift the situation. And Deborah reminds us that one decision in the middle of uncertainty can lead others forward. So let me ask you this, and I want you to really think about it. Where have you been holding back? Where have you been quiet when you know you should speak? Where have you been waiting when you know you should move? Where have you been doubting yourself when God has already positioned you? Because the truth is, a lot of people are waiting for clarity before they act. They're waiting for that moment to feel ready. They're waiting to feel confident. They're waiting for everything to line up perfectly. But if these stories teach us anything, it's this. You don't always get clarity first. Sometimes you get the opportunity first, and your response reveals your purpose. And Esther didn't have all the answers. Deborah didn't have perfect conditions, but they both made a decision, and that was this. That decision made the difference. And so as we close out this episode, especially during Women's History Month, I don't just want you to think about the women that we've talked about. I want you to think about your role, the role that you're playing right now in your own life, because history isn't just something that we look back on. It's something that we're actively creating in our homes, in our workplaces, and in our communities, in the way we show up every day. And maybe you're standing before a king like Esther. Maybe you're not leading a nation like Deborah, but you're in a moment, and that moment matters. So here's my challenge to you on today. Don't wait for a perfect time. Don't wait until you feel completely ready. Don't wait until fear disappears. Move away. Move anyway. Speak anyway. Lead anyway. Trust that God knew what he was doing when he placed you where you are. Trust that your life is not random. Trust that your voice carries weight, and trust that the moment that you're in right now is not by accident, because just like Esther was placed in the palace, and just like Deborah was raised up to lead, you are here in this generation, in this moment, for a reason, for such a time as this. Let me pray for you. God, I thank you, oh God, for every position or every person listening right now. I thank you that their life has purpose, even when they didn't fully see it. I pray that you would give them clarity where there is confusion, courage where there is fear, and boldness where there has been hesitation. Help them to recognize moments in front of them, oh God, and help them to use their voice with wisdom, and help them to step into what you've called them to do without shrinking back. Let them know that they are not alone, that you are with them in every decision, in every step, in every moment, and their obedience can make a difference. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, if this episode spoke to you, I want you to share it with someone who needs it, because you never know who's in a moment right now trying to figure out if they should step forward. And as always, stay rooted, stay real, stay faithful, and I'll see you in the next episode. Be blessed, don't stress, let go and let God. And as I always say, respect God, self, and everyone else, and the world should be a better place. Good
The
night.
Awakening Your Faith podcast is a bold, Spirit-led space where truth is spoken without compromise and faith is stirred without performance. Hosted by Pastor Aaron J., this podcast is dedicated to awakening believers from spiritual familiarity and calling them back to authentic relationship with God. Each episode dives deep into real conversations about salvation, leadership, church culture, spiritual warfare, obedience, identity, healing, and the weight of God's presence. This is not surface-level inspiration, this is transformation. Whether you're wrestling with doubt, recovering from church hurt, seeking clarity in leadership, or hungry for revival in your personal walk, this podcast meets you where you are and challenges you to grow. Pastor Aaron J. speaks with transparency, conviction, and compassion, blending biblical truth with real-life application in a way that is both relatable and